Teaching impaired children. Impaired can have many different meanings. These techniques and ideas which we will discuss are going to cover a main focus of visually and hearing impaired children. The basics which we will cover are addressing the situation from the get-go, preparation and accommodations are necessary, clear and concise lectures and lessons are beneficial, and teacher and parent involvement is also helpful. In the beginning of the year or duration of instructing, it is important to address to your class that you are aware that they may be impaired, and if there is any concern, the students are able to bring it up to you directly. Your opening statements say a lot about you as an educator. This is the time to make sure your students know you're equipped to handle their impaired needs. Stating things like, if you are in need of assistance or accommodations, I am more than happy to help, so please let me know, will ensure that your students know to be comfortable to come to you if they need anything. Certain accommodations must be made to make a comfortable environment for most impaired children. Whether it be visual or hearing, a teacher should be prepared for either. Examples of different accommodations for impaired children might be lighting, notes, tests and assignments, and verbal communication. The first example which we discussed was lighting. This includes classroom lighting, hallway lighting, and any other lighting in the building for that matter. Many visually impaired children have a hard time adjusting to lights that are bright and also dim. It is important to know this about your students. Seeing as you want their environment of learning to be comfortable, you must be aware of what makes them comfortable. The next example which we talked about is notes. Visually and hearing impaired children may most likely need notes in different formats. For visually impaired children, this could mean recordings or notes in Braille form. And for hearing impaired children, they might need the notes to be signed to them in order to write them down and interpret them. This goes hand in hand with the next accommodation which we'll talk about, which was tests and assignments. Students may need test and assignment accommodations. This may include things like more time to take their exams, oral examinations, and even assignments in different formats. It is important to make sure that all your students are accommodated and benefiting from the accommodations that you make. The next example that was mentioned was verbal communication. Not all students will be able to communicate in the same way, especially impaired students. Things like hearing and eyesight can make it hard for social cues, which include things like knowing when to raise your hand. It may be necessary to communicate in other ways that aren't just verbal. For example, writing your verbal words on the board while you speak, or displaying sign language that goes along with your lecture. This would ensure that your students are all following at the same pace and retaining all the information completely. This could also include things like pace of speaking and enunciation. The second basic that we talked about is the importance when dealing with impaired children of all types to be able to be clear and direct with what is expected and what is being taught. Some examples of these clear lesson types are lessons in different formats, multiple ways of demonstrating and explaining, and giving advance, warning, and guidance. Different format examples include things like audio aids, which include things like a tape recorder, and also visual aids, which include things like a poster board. In order to be clear and concise, you must have clear demonstrating and explaining. This may include things like multiple explanations, one-on-one attention, and visual along with verbal demonstrations. This will ensure that your student is understanding all the material that you are teaching in the way that benefits them. The next way to be clear and concise was advance warning and guidance. The next clear and concise way of teaching is advance warning and guidance. This would include things like thorough deadlines in advance and guidelines to ensure your students are aware what is expected of them, whether it be for a project or just a daily activity. The next basic that we discussed was parent and guardian involvement. This is key when dealing with impaired and disabled children. The child's guardian is the person who's going to know them the best, especially seeing as many are not able to advocate for themselves. There can be many different forms of parent involvement. An example of this involvement is an IEP. These are individualized education plans. IEPs are documented plans to ensure that a student who is impaired is going to receive accommodations in the ways that are necessary and best to suit them in an educational environment. Here's an example of an IEP meeting to better inform you.
Why don't we start with introductions? As you all know, I'm Jerry Johnson, and I'm the school principal here.
I'm Danielle Adams, Emma's special education teacher.
I'm Emma.
I'm Kathy Rogers, Emma's mother. Lisa Coleman, Emma's math teacher.
The purpose of this meeting is to talk about accommodations that may help Emma during classroom instruction. We also want to prepare for the state test in the spring. It's good that we're meeting early to get this all sorted out.
I agree. I spoke with Emma last week about her classes. She said she's having particular difficulty with math this year, even though she's been a good math student in the past. We talked about accommodations that might help her during math. Emma, do you want to share what we talked about?
Like listening to my math book?
Exactly.
We talked about listening to my math book on the computer, and I want to do that.
So Lisa and I have been working together on this, and she's working on ordering an audio version of the text.
So you said this is an accommodation. How would that work?
Well, Emma would be able to listen to an audio version of the text in her math book. This may help her to understand better. Some of the math vocabulary in the textbook is difficult, and we don't want that interfering with Emma's learning.
Yeah, we've also talked about possibly providing a read-aloud accommodation during classroom tests.
So what would this look like?
Well, a paraprofessional or a resource teacher like Danielle would read the test questions to Emma aloud. We could try this on her weekly quizzes.
Then we would collect data to see if the accommodation is working. How does everyone feel about this? We could try reading the test items aloud on her math quizzes to see if it works.
I think we should try. What do you think, Emma?
Okay.
We should keep this accommodation in mind as we think about the upcoming state test. Also, I know that the read-aloud accommodation is permitted on the mathematics assessment.
As you can see in the video, Emma doesn't necessarily seem impaired, and there is an IEP plan in place for her which will help her benefit for her learning. Impaired children most times require many different needs for their learning, and it is important that teachers be aware of all of them. Parent and teacher involvement not only helps the students, but the teacher and parents benefit from it as well. They have a more trusting and a stronger relationship out of it. The article which I found that talks about teaching kids who are impaired is a Facts on Hand article. The article was entitled Tips for Working with Blind Students. The article discussed different techniques and accommodations that a teacher can make for their impaired student, specifically blind students. It talked about many different things that blind students need, such as ways of formatting documents, and duration of time needed to thoroughly grasp a lesson with their needs and accommodations. The article gave examples like the time it takes a blind student to solve a math problem and the difference in pace of a student reading a summary and the time it takes for a summary to be read aloud to a blind student and for their brain to process that reading. It also discussed the incorporation of computers and other technology and how it can be beneficial for a visually impaired student or impaired student in general. The main thing which stuck out to me in this article was the elaboration of organization, discipline, and other teaching methods that goes into accommodating for a blind student in order to ensure that they learn just as well as the other students are. Can working with impaired students be challenging? The answer is yes. Impaired students have many needs. This can be very overwhelming and hard to accommodate at times. For me, I believe that organization and patience are the most important aspects to accommodating students who are impaired. What do you think is the most important aspect, and why do you believe it should be number one?